how do you see the U.S. foreign policy considering Ukraine and Israel? It seems to me that both of these conflicts are the failure of the U.S. foreign policy.
Well, I would have to agree on that. I mean, we've talked at some length about Ukraine in the past, and here we have this war breaking out of the Middle East exactly at the time in which the much ballyhooed Ukrainian offensive has totally failed. In one sense, that may be bring a sense of relief to the Biden administration, because it takes attention off of that. But then it points to the Middle East and our relations there. And here again is another failure, as you just said. The United States has been so blindly supportive of Israel that has just looked the other way, as Netanyahu has brought in perhaps the most right-wing, hardline administration in recent Israeli history, has just what's happened. The tragedy that's happened in Israel is an outcropping in many ways of those hardline policies, and now we have a war that has broken out that could become a regional war. You know, the U.S. gives lip service to concern about the Palestinians and so forth, but where's the diplomacy? Nima, is the same situation as we had in Ukraine. There's no diplomacy. As far as the Middle East goes, where's Jimmy Carter? If he wasn't pushing 100 years old, I would tell him, bring him back, because at least we had some diplomacy then to try to bring the two sides together. And we could go on at length with just this one question, but what we're having here too is the long-lasting legacy of colonialism and imperialism. It goes all the way back to the First World War. And the United States has picked up where Britain left off, when Britain was so influential in the Middle East. And, the British in part bear blame for the current situations in promising both the Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims, as well as the Israelis, nationhood and building hopes and what have you, out of its own sort of colonial system at that time. And now we have here, all these years later, still conflict, civilians being killed and what have you, and no resolution. And the United States has sort of picked up the role that Britain once had in this region.
When it comes to Israel and what's going on in Israel right now, it seems to me that nobody seems to care what's going on in that region until something big happens in that region.
Yes.
Why during all these years, why they're not thinking a diplomatic solution, as you mentioned? What is the official U.S. policy in Israel? Are they seeking continuous struggle, continuous battle between Israelis and Palestinians?
Joe Biden talks about, well, I want to sort of encourage some sort of resolution to this problem. We hope Israel will take into consideration the lives of civilians and so forth. My gosh, where's the pressure? The United States supplies them with endless amounts of money and munitions. Where's pressure? Instead of, I hope they come to this decision or that decision. The Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza, have been living in concentration camp-like conditions for years now. This is the most recent of a half dozen wars breaking out over that region and beyond. And over these years, nothing, like you're saying, nothing has been done as we've watched Netanyahu come back into power, and not only back into power, but assembling, like I said, a hardline administration that takes no pity whatsoever on the Palestinians. And here we have really ethnic cleansing going on by him ordering the residents of the Gaza Strip to go further south and to leave their homes and what have you, to go or else be killed. And then they come to the south. The border is still closed because of attacks on the border with Egypt. And what are they going to do? Supplies are running out. There's no water. I mean, my gosh, this is and here is Israel doing this, made up of people and their descendants who survived the Holocaust, and now acting in many ways like Nazis, at least toward the and this is a strong statement, I know, but toward the Palestinian people. I'm not defending Hamas here. What Hamas did was awful. It was awful and needs to be condemned. But then but you don't sort of try to sort of address evil with more evil. Where's, like we're saying, diplomacy?
It seems as this conflict is happening in Israel, the importance of the Ukraine war is fading away. Is that going to change the view of US Congress and their support of Ukraine war, or they're thinking of supporting both of them?
I was just reading today that the military industrial complex is feeling the pressure now of providing more military supplies to Israel, as well as continuing to supply Ukraine in its war. And our own reserves are depleted, and there's just so much you can do at this point. I think, as I said earlier, I think in one sense, Biden and company are happy to get the attention off this failed offensive from Ukraine. However, Biden is still he wants to be a reelected president. He doesn't want this war to end. He doesn't want a loss on his watch. He's just recently asked for $200 million more for Ukraine, and hoping to combine that in a military package for Israel, thinking that those growing numbers, particularly in the House, who are not so happy with the Ukrainian war, will accept that just because, so they can also fund Israel, which Israel still has largely almost unanimous support across Congress. That shows he's still trying to sort of keep the funding going, although 200 million is quite a lot less than what he's asked for in the past. He wants to keep that war going, and after he gets elected, I'm not sure he really cares what happens to Ukraine. Get through next November, and Ukraine can figure it out what it's going to do in its future. I think that implies a certain cynicism in the White House, but from their actions, that's what I see.
With this funds and weapons that they're sending to Ukraine, is this attitude toward Ukraine is benefiting Ukraine, or is harming Ukraine?
It's harming Ukraine. It's harming the Ukrainian people. What is Ukraine without the Ukrainian people? The Ukrainian people are dying every day on the battlefield, in their villages and towns where the war is being raged. To continue that war just means more death. It does not mean that they're going to win. They are not going to win this war. They have already lost the war. And so to just continue the funding is just, it's awful, and it's immoral. And it's only being done for political reasons, not only with Biden and the White House, but also in Europe and with NATO. It serves their purpose as well. These politicians, Macron and the others, have staked their political lives on Ukrainian war. And so if it goes south, then what happens to their political futures? And so they're looking at their own political sort of survival, and thus keeping Ukraine going, at least to their next elections and what have you. But I think there's growing restiveness among the people, particularly in Europe and in the United States. We're seeing it already in the House and in Congress. And so it's going to be more and more of an uphill battle to keep this Ukrainian war going. And now in particular with what's going on in Israel, Israel still enjoys very strong support in Congress, I think much more than Ukraine does. And so if they're going to be looking at which war are we going to support, they're going to look toward Israel.
How do you see this change that is coming to Europe? In Slovakia, you have a new president who's not supporting the war in Ukraine. Are we going to see more changes in Europe, in your opinion?
Well, I thought it was very interesting, the election in Slovakia. I have friends there, and I've traveled to Slovakia, and they've had, like all the Eastern European countries and Central European countries, they've had their struggles to sort of bring about a democracy after many years. So yes, that's another chink in the armor for NATO. Now, you just had elections in Poland, but the results in Poland were more mixed. You had an opposition party to basically not command a majority, but enough where they're going to probably end up in the ruling Poland, and they're more inclined toward the European Union and what have you. And so you've gotten mixed results there. But I'll tell you, Slovakia is important because that means Slovakia and Hungary are two NATO nations that are not happy at all with this war. And the Polish elections, even if you had a sort of a EU type of, with Tusk taking over there, there's growing disaffection with the Ukrainian war within Poland.
Considering the conflict in Israel, we know that the region is changing with these new relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. These are two regional powers, and they're influencing the Shia and Sunni in that region. How do you see these changes that are happening in the Middle East, considering the fight that is going on in Israel?
That is extremely interesting. You've got a new relationship now, as you said, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered by the Chinese. You've got, with Russia, you've got a longstanding support by the Russians going back to the days of the Soviet Union for the Palestinian people. And thus you've got credibility in the Arab and the Muslim world. And you've got China going about the world with this Bricks and Roads campaign to build infrastructure across the world, really connecting China with the world as a whole. They're not doing like the United States. When the United States comes in, we're going to build military bases. What Chinese are coming in and building dams and roads and what have you, factories, and creating a lot of good relations in that way. And also providing through the BRICS organization and so forth, with its member organizations, an alternative to the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which ladens struggling countries with debt that they can hardly survive. And so, yes, you've got changing relations there, and and you're looking at sort of positive changes, diplomacy, Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by the Chinese. Longstanding sort of with Russia. Russia also has fairly good relations with Israel as well. So it has an ear on both sides of the table. And what do you have with the United States? You have a mess. I'm sorry. You have this sort of unblinking support for Israel, lip service to the Palestinians. You haven't had any real effort to sort of bring about a peace, some sort of resolution for years now, and so people are aware of that in the Middle East. They understand. They see this going on, and so they say they're looking toward their future. And what you've got here too in Israel, this is going to sort of bring really into the spotlight what has been going on in Israel and its attitude toward the Palestinians. The world is now going to see it. It has to be talked about. The media has to pay attention to the story. It can't ignore it any longer. And it's going to be such an eye-opening experience for many people around the world. You mean that they're treated that badly? Israel is doing this, even given the horror of what Hamas did, but that turning that around as an excuse then to sort of ethnic cleanse the Gaza Strip and so forth. That's going to be a changing situation itself for the Middle East and for the world as a whole. I'll also add here too, what does this mean for Netanyahu's future? Netanyahu has I think he's focused so much on domestic end of politics in Israel that he sort of allowed perhaps the security to become lax and allow this these attacks by Hamas. I don't know Israeli politics that closely, but I know that he's had his own, within Israel, he's tried to sort of solidify his power in almost a dictatorial way, trying to take over the court system. There's a lot of disaffection with that. He's had his own charges of corruption against him. And so now with this breach in security, what does that mean for Netanyahu's future? That's going to be interesting to watch.
Do you see any long-term assessment, long-term solution in the Netanyahu administration or in the Biden administration for what's going on in Israel?
I don't see much of a long-term solution with Netanyahu or Biden. I think we're talking about figures of who are eventually going to be figures of the past. They're not figures of the future. I don't see them having a real future vision. They're playing catch up. I love my country. I'm an American. I'm proud to be an American, but I see here where the United States is put into a position, both in its attitude toward Russia and China, the war in Ukraine, now in the Middle East, as sort of clinging to what is becoming an old world vision and view, this rules-based order and so forth. And I see China and Russia merging with a new view of the world, a changing world in which there's not one power controlling everything, being the United States, where we've got to live together and try to not fight each other, but work together to make the world a better place. Where's that vision among our leaders and our diplomats? I mean, here you've got Blinken, who went to Saudi Arabia. You know, the prince there made him wait for hours. That shows that was one of our closest allies there, not to defend the Saudis in that country, but a rare ally within that part of the world. And now that's the way we're getting treated, our diplomats and so forth. And so the world is changing, and I'm not sure Joe Biden or Netanyahu realize that.
Joe, what we've seen in Ukraine, that Russia from day one, even after going into Ukraine, they were trying to negotiate with the Biden administration, with the Zelensky administration, and they rejected all negotiations. And right now in Israel, it's the same attitude. Now China and Russia are talking about the first step for putting an end to this conflict in Israel gonna be the acceptance of the statehood of Palestine. And this is the first step to start solving these problems in that region. For the time being, we see the Biden administration is advocating for sending weapons, for fighting more. The same policy, the same attitude.
Here's where you can almost look back nostalgically to the days of Jimmy Carter, when you had, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat actually coming together and talking across the table from one another, something almost unimaginable today. The Middle East has troubles beyond the West. In fact, Egypt is fearful of just opening the floodgates to the Gaza residents to come on in, because that brings Hamas in, and Israel and Egypt's not too happy with Hamas, because these represent an extremist organization or view of the Muslim faith that they're uncomfortable with and worried what that might be, upsetting to their own sort of political stability. So you've got disputes within the Muslim world, of course. That's where the major countries could play a positive role in sort of finding some sort of through diplomacy and what have you, finding some sort of way to get all feuding parties onto the table to talk to one another. And we're all fearful that what's going to come out of this too is a new wave of terrorism around the world, and it very well could. And we're already seeing some examples of this. When are we going to address the causes of terrorism? What leads to these extreme, not to excuse these extreme measures and the murders and the kidnappings and so forth, but what are the causes that lead to terrorism? If you take away the causes and sort of address those things, then you undermine the support for terrorists. And but I don't see that we have anyone out there among the major Western powers trying to do that right now. The closest thing you're going to have are some of the efforts from Russia and China. I hate to say it, and this is not to defend Putin as some great democratic leader or whatever, but you see little hints of changes here and there. The Russia proposed a resolution to the United Nations Security Council about condemning attacks on civilians and what have you in Gaza, and also calling for peace and so forth. It was rejected by the United States and its closest allies because it didn't mention Hamas. It's funny how the media is a big part of the story, and you and I've discussed too how in fact, they've got the story here how the Associated Press reported the Russian resolution only got 4 votes, and there's the China, United Arab Emirates, Mozambique, and Gabon. Well, then later in the story mentioned only 4 voted against it. And that was the United States, Britain, France, and Japan. 6 other nations abstained. That means really 6 nations refused to attack the Russian resolution rather than abstain from it. even within the UN, which is, basically sort of taking the Western position toward Ukraine, you're seeing more and more sort of a difference of opinion, different approaches to these different conflicts.
How do you see the role of the UN in this whole situation in Ukraine, in Israel?
The UN has lost a lot of credibility, I think, and it certainly has since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. It seems to be sort of listening to the dominant voices within the UN from the West, the United States, and Western Europe. And, I think that this has been looked upon with concern in other parts of the world. We're seeing growing sort of restiveness and within the so-called global South. And we see China and Russia aligning itself with the global South. We see, in the Sahel region and in Africa and what have you, a desire to sort of rid the last remnants of colonialism. And where's the UN in all this? The UN is definitely not taking a leadership role. It seems to be following rather than leading. And I don't know what the future there is. Perhaps, as this world changes and the BRICS organization, in other words, as a counterpart to the West, begin to grow and influence, perhaps that's going to have an influence on the UN as well. And it's a sort of actions toward the world. They look at the West and they hear what they say, but then they see what their actions are. Western interference in Africa, for example, to many African nations seems like a replay of the old colonial days, where they want to sort of wield influence, make sound like they're all about helping African nations or what have you, but it's ultimately selfish. It's ultimately for their self-interest, and more nations are realizing not that China and Russia aren't also self-interested and what have you, but they've had a different viewpoint toward it, where, as I've said before, where China is helping build infrastructure, particularly China, and rather than just increasing the war machine and these confrontational sort of infrastructure, whatever, this confrontational with between the East and the West. I really think that, yes, these nations are more and more aware of that. They feel their own sort of growing power through their unity, a growing unity. And so that's why the G20, UN are becoming less and less relevant to them, at least unless there are going to be some big changes. The G20, I think, is already a thing of the past in many ways. And the UN does this. I'd have to say there's still potential there for a future, but it's going to have to change because of these sort of different ways of looking at the world that's emerging out of the global South and the other parts of the world that are not the West.
Admiral John Kirby stating that we are at the end of the rope in Ukraine. It seems that the long-term assistance, the long-term support for Ukraine is not anymore the case.
Perhaps they're reading the tea leaves that there's just no way that Ukraine can win this war. They've seen that with the Ukrainian offensive, they didn't even break through the first defense line. And there were 3 entrenched defense lines that the Russian had built. They didn't even get through the first one. These little drone attacks here and there don't mean a thing. The folks in the Pentagon and the State Department know that. They're sort of things to catch the headlines one day to sort of keep up the hope or whatever. So, and then Biden is asking for $200 million. It's basically sort of to keep the thing, going along until he can get reelected or whatever. And but I think Zelensky's got to be feeling the pressure. He must be really unhappy right now. He's no longer on the front pages. He's no longer on the evening news. All the attention has been turned to the Middle East, and nobody's really even thinking much about Ukraine right now. And that's got to be driving Zelensky, who's an actor, a comedian. He loves the attention, driving him crazy. But Zelensky's also got to be worried about his own future. What is going to be his future if if indeed there's behind the scenes pressure, and I think there probably is, for him to sort of find some sort of way to negotiate with the Russians, then what's that going to mean for his own future? All of these politicians, including those in the West, in Western Europe, Joe Biden and Zelensky, are worried about their own political futures, I think, as much as anything else. And so, yeah, I think the administration is seeing that there's a growing body of members in the House, a few in the Senate, who are coming to the end of their rope as far as supporting this war. And now you've even got our like I said earlier, the military industrial complex saying we just can't keep supplying wars everywhere. They're making a lot of money. They would love to, but there's a limit to everything. And so, yeah, their pressures are on, and so there's a lot of discussions going on behind the scenes for sure.